again, for those who haven't been a part of this discussion so far, the idea of the development ready community framework is to create a system to help the state and municipalities work together to better achieve outcomes on the ground. So it's also focused on investment. So getting past conversations and really moving into like, you know, what we need to do to invest well within our state. And we've talked a lot about return on investment and looking at various land types, patterns of development to really get a sense for what kinds of development produce a positive fiscal return for our communities in our state, and you know which patterns have increase in tax revenue that offsets the cost of the infrastructure that it takes to support that development. And so this model really attempts to take funding from the state and direct it into communities who are doing the work it takes to make their communities development ready, and then finding funding to direct into development projects within those communities. So this is a flow chart that is new, I think, for most of you. It's a modification based on some questions we got about you know, what the criteria are meant to do. So essentially, there's a set of criteria that we can go through in a minute, but those are criteria that municipalities check off to demonstrate that they're ready for development. And then once that happens, the projects within their priority development areas can get funding. So the projects themselves don't need to meet the criteria. It's really the municipality. And by default, sort of the projects within that area are hitting those targets. But we'll just walk through this. So the idea is that we're talking about program funding. There's different sources for funding that might work for this program. There's existing programs at the state that are already funneling money into places that you might consider to be development ready areas, and then new pots of money. We talked a little bit last week about how the regional planning organizations could help serve as an extension to do technical assistance for municipalities, especially those who don't have resources and staff within their government structure. And so they would work with the communities to meet the development ready community criteria. And once they've done that, they would complete a self-assessment check form, which is a pretty basic overview of what they've done to meet the criteria. And then the state would review those development criteria and make a determination. If communities were in keeping with those criteria, like I said, they'd be eligible for funding for specific development projects, whether it's private investment of buildings on land or, you know, street projects or public space projects. As part of meeting the criteria, we'll go through, there's a number of items related to identifying local priority development areas, and those are the places that have a positive return on investment where infrastructure is already in place, where there's a number of opportunities to meet multiple goals, whether it's related to climate change, housing, transportation, public health, the list goes on and on. Then, you know, one thing that I think has been brought up by a few people is that the RPOs could work with the member communities to rank and submit projects for funding. And then the state would allocate funding for development ready projects. And ta-da, funding is received for local projects. And increased tax revenue and TIF could help support the program. So that's kind of an overview, and this is all really up for discussion. This is one potential scenario of how the state and region and municipalities could work together to move through So we can talk more about that, and would love to kind of dig into that with everybody.
So we've had a few notes in the chat box. We have a question from Jim. If state investments producing better outcomes is a core element, should the name be changed from development ready to investment ready? And I think this is a, really thought-provoking question that just received from response from Shelley, who likes investment ready. What do you thoughts?
What's that?
Okay, I'll move on to the next one. Jane says, an arrow needs to come out of the yellow box after state review of readiness.
Yep.
And, Jane also asked, does this imply local TIF revenue would go into the state pot?
It's a good question. I think the answer is usually no, but people who know more about TIF might want to jump in on that, and this might be need to be revised.
Yeah, I would just suggest revising that so that it doesn't imply that local TIF money goes back into the state pool.
Yep.
That could go for more local projects instead.
Okay. Good comment.
On the changing of the name from development ready to investment ready, George says, I think development ready works great. It's a language we've been working with up to this point. So switching it might be a little confusing, but yes. Great.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay, so let's just skip over here. So in the state bucket, there's two big categories. One's technical assistance and one's financial investment. And the technical assistance could work in tandem with regional. This is a update from last week with my terminology not being accurate. Regional planning organizations, and yep, so managing the program, helping facilitate planning work, and then helping support actual development, getting in the ground and realizing state and local goals. And then financial investment, again, working with programs that already exist, and making sure that the programs align with the state's goals as well as communities. And then looking again for new sources of funding for projects that don't currently fit within any programs, such as construction of new housing, which in most of Maine doesn't pencil financially. So, we've really been trying to put on our thinking caps on where we can get some new funding to help support missing middle housing and local street projects and whatever else people need to make their local priorities happen. Talked a little.
Just a quick comment from Jane. I wonder if FHWA funding could also be a pool of funds.
Federal Highway.
Okay.
Because they helped fund the Gateway 1 process, yep. And they were, I don't know how that would all work and if they could be pulled into it. A lot of money there.
All right, that's good. I'll add that to the list of things to investigate. We talked a little bit last week about the role of regional planning organizations. This language is in the draft sent out a couple days ago. So this was an attempt to kind of put a proposal out there based on what I think I heard on the last call. So if people have feedback on this, just take a moment to read it and just send me edits, comments offline. We're also trying to look at incentives, like, what might the state say, within priority development areas, these kind of rules may not apply, which is, there's a lot of press out there from other states where they've kind of set some relief on certain programs within areas that are targeted for development and investment. So priority development areas, this is really, I hope we can talk more about these this week to see if we're on the right track in terms of what the priority development areas should be. And if we've got all the areas that we should, and if you think about it from the perspective of a number of different types of communities, if most communities are covered in some way in terms of having access to funding for these kind of places. So the first one is downtown, whether it's a city or a smaller downtown village center, which is a more low density condition, but still, mix of uses, such as I think of Yarmouth and their little villages. Rural Crossroads is a smaller moment of, collection of commercial, residential, civic. We have these all over our communities, and a lot of towns, municipalities might have more than one of these, so that's totally okay. Expected. High impact corridor, I always think immediately of Route 1 in Brunswick. It's the one I drive through all the time, but Wyndham, these are all over. Yeah. And these have infrastructure in place. They're within fairly close proximity to downtowns, and their potential for a lot of mixed use redevelopment to take advantage of the investments that have been made there.
Kara, there's still a little bit of discussion on the chat about the investment and pots of funding. So I'll just read through those real quickly. So Jim, back to Jane's comment about federal highway funds. Vanessa said it should be looked at as part of the conversation with MDOT, and it might be, and Jane says yes, but could it be targeted to this program? Jim agrees with Jane and proposes that all state revenue streams, direct and pass through, be identified and placed into this matrix. I think on this point, it would be really helpful for everybody to sort of put their, the ones that are first and foremost in their minds into the comments so that we can collect this. Jim says, development-ready communities might be the baseline platform upon which more detailed program-specific requirements can be set. And George says that he thinks it would be especially helpful inventory to complete, as it would lessen the chance that we've missed something. And then Ken goes on to say, many communities went through urban renewal in the late 70s and early 80s and are in need of redevelopment in these downtown areas. And Jane's added some more potential funding sources to our list. So feel free to just keep adding those. We save the chat file and go through the notes later.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. So adjacent neighborhoods are typically primarily residential, but might have some moments of commercial and exist adjacent to a downtown. And then
quick question from Shelley. Can someone explain why 80 years / 1940 is the threshold for establishment of these priority areas?
Yes. So again, this is all proposal, but the idea is, and there's different dates in here, you'll notice. So the way historic dating works is it's 50 years, but in terms of these areas, that didn't really seem appropriate because these areas are really, in some ways, defined by when they were built. So the high impact corridors that were built close to downtowns within a couple miles typically were done largely prior to 1980. And that was my assessment, having looked at a number of them. But, if people have other information on that and, want to study the dates and this number as well. This is sort of my first take on what I saw, but that's why I'm hoping that a lot more people can look at these areas and the criteria and make sure that they capture the kinds of places that will, should be the focus of investment.
Yeah, we have chats blowing up. It's great. So George says, and within historic preservation, there's the federal credit 20% and the state credit 25%. Mark says 53, and I feel like he's referring to your comment that historic is 50 years, but I'm not exactly sure. So Mark, feel free to jump in if you'd like. Jane says, for commercial strip areas, would funding be allowed and approved only if the commercial strip is retrofitted, i.e. improve the development pattern, improve the return from these properties, improve the tax potential with a more urban form of development. And then Jim says, development-ready communities could be incorporated into Maine QAP. George says he thinks it's a good threshold for development patterns with regards to pre-World War II and post-World War II when we saw a lot of sprawl. So there's a little bit of back and forth. Do you want to respond to any of those comments in general?
To Jane's question, yes, the intent is that if you're redeveloping within a high impact corridor, that it would be adding more value to existing infrastructure. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'll keep on with the comments. So I said that one. Haley says she's going to bring back questions regarding DOT and FHWA to the folks in her office. Thanks, Haley. And Nate asks, could it be that pre-World War II neighborhoods are considered to look and feel more historic because they were built for walkability and the houses were a different measure of quality? Very good question. Jane says, but you would not get funding if you're continuing the strip pattern. We should state that somewhere.
Okay.
Also, does a priority area need to be historic? Does this prioritize redevelopment over new, well-designed development?
Yeah, so that last question, we've actually got a lot of comments on that. So all of these that we've talked about so far, priority development areas, are trying to focus on places where we've already made investments and build on those investments. But there are a number of communities in Maine that are growing and that don't have a downtown or village center, and that are talking about creating them. And so we've also been discussing ways to make sure that when a community is doing the hard work of planning with its citizenry, that there are opportunities to lay out new priority development areas. And so there's a little language in here in this opening paragraph about, it says a community may identify locations for newly established priority development areas as part of a comprehensive planning process where the community can demonstrate that there is no existing priority development area of the same place type and where the newly established area meets the criteria, accepting historic criteria. So basically, you don't have to meet those date thresholds. So feedback on that would be helpful.
Yeah, so George is responding more to Nate's question and Nate's point. He says, I would answer yes to Nate's point because historic is generally associated with central business districts with a long-standing community history of commercial and business use along residential, in short, Main Street. Or in cases of really old buildings pre-Civil War, what we might call a village center.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to sort of explain themselves a little bit more or just jump in, please feel free to unmute yourself. Like, we're happy to continue this as a regular conversation, not just chat conversation.
So the last priority development area is the rural farmstead, which, you know, at a certain point in Maine's history, the farm was the rural economic center of a lot of our communities. And at a certain point we said, let's put all businesses in business parks instead of in rural, and kind of shut down rural as being open for a variety of different kinds of businesses. So, you know, we've been thinking a lot about how can we support agricultural working landscapes and working forests. And so this is an attempt to kind of put a little bit more focus on that type of business activity, and make sure that we're you know, supporting all of Maine and not just the communities that have built up village centers and downtowns. So
I had a question, Kara, about the rural farmsteads.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the effort to include farms and to include especially historic ones, but you know, from a point of view of development ready, I didn't feel like it had to be in there, because the density, you know, the density is so low on rural farmsteads, and the other, I think from a risk standpoint, there are so many places in Maine that, you know, that you could qualify as a rural farmstead, even a historic one, even if you limit the criteria that way. So, I mean, my thought for you is, I think out of these 6, I don't think you have to throw in the rural farmstead. I think the Rural Crossroads does a nice job of making sure that our, you know, really, really small farming communities still feel like they're included. Just a thought for you on that.
I don't know if others have anything they want to chime in. I think part of the concept of the rural farmstead is that our farms, in many cases, used to be a little bit more dense. They used to have multiple residential properties or multiple businesses, and that there's a lot of difficulties that farmers face because of capital investments that they can't make to increase their business activity, and then also zoning rules making it difficult to potentially build additional units of housing to support farm workers or what have you. So this was meant to, you know, in a similar way as this program is supporting landowners in village areas, also supporting landowners in rural areas who are trying to, you know, create business and business activity. So
I would just suggest that it probably should be stated somewhere that the goal is not to encourage development of farm areas into commercial subdivisions or residential subdivisions. I mean, if you're continuing a rural farm pattern of growth for supporting businesses or housing, that's good, but you don't want to imply that there's money here to develop farms into subdivisions or something like that.
Yep.
I agree with Jane, and I think that was George's comment about rural farmsteads. I think that I think it's important to include them, just because if we're, you know, if this plan is perceived as being prescriptive in some way about built up areas, people will just go do what they've been doing since whenever, and go buy a bunch of farmland and put up a subdivision. So it's part of the equation for sure. I would love to see more local farming in Hallowell, where I work, and Gardner, where I live, because I think we'll be experiencing the unintended consequences of the distributed food system for the next year or so, and not having supports in place or plans in place for local farming as part of a functioning local economy. It's sort of magical thinking. So I don't know why, but just the idea of the town and It's a Wonderful Life came into my mind as I was listening, and that local economy was struggling too, but they had people who sold stuff and farmers and people who worked on houses and all of these things that I think we're trying to support with this model. And it's just easier said than done, but it may be what's back in the forefront in the aftermath of the coronavirus correction.
If I can jump in, I'm wondering if instead of rural farmstead, are we looking to support urban agriculture as well? And maybe there's just a way that we support agricultural development that supports the farm, whether it be farm housing or additional services they can offer or capital investment for processing or other facilities.
George, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think Nate's point is well made, but also yours about zoning was also well made. We don't have zoning in Rumford, and so obviously that wasn't the thought of adding residential units into an existing farmstead wasn't something that occurred to me, but it would be certainly a problem. I think for Nate, I think he's got Nate, correct me if I'm wrong, and I apologize if I don't understand your zoning rules in Hollowell, but I think if a farm in Hollowell wanted to add a housing unit at an existing farm, they might not be able to do so all that easily right now, and that's probably the case in a lot of communities in Maine. I mean, there's farms even in Augusta that are right on the outskirts that might have a little bit of difficulty. So I thought that was a very significant point, and to this is a good example of for us and for many of the maybe even the unorganized territories or some of the really small towns, we wouldn't ever even worry about adding a housing unit on a farm. But for you and for areas where there's much denser settlement, that's actually a problem. That's a significant problem.
Yeah, I think you're right, George. It's a totally different Maine, right? And so we have acres of good untouched farmland that aren't being farmed. And our zoning is modeled around the subdivision 2-acre, 2,000 square foot cul-de-sac that the city ends up taking over as a public road model. And I think maybe I get more agreement with this group than others that I talk to, but I think that model's dead. And not only is it dead, but it's bankrupting the city. And furthermore, we need people to farm. So until we change the values and priorities around how that land is used and what farming does for our local economy, we're going to continue to beat our head against a brick wall trying to understand why mill rates keep going up. When I had to cut all of the infrastructure and equipment allocations out of my budget this year because we're going to have half the revenue we got last year from the state. I'm preaching to the choir, but we're going bankrupt here, just standing still, and something has to change. And I think that for places like Central Maine, where the land is still affordable at a farm cost versus Southern Maine, where land is being sold at I think more so at least at a development cost, we have opportunities to see that land transfer for farming. But we don't have the zoning that would support it. It's almost like the zoning is working against it. And some changes there would, I think, help clarify the value of that land for feeding the community. Thank you.
Hey, Kara, we have a couple more questions.
Really great conversation.
This is great. From Jim. So Jim says, if one, all of the place types are identified, and two, all of the technical and financial investment streams are identified, then a sorting of appropriate resources can be focused on on appropriate places in a systematized approach. Certain P/F investment streams are appropriate for only certain place types. So the development ready community system can structure the applications appropriately.
So I was just going to flip over. We had two people, Nate and Jane, provide some images on their development ready priority development areas. So Nate, these are yours. Do you want to just walk us through these, and I'll just scroll and you can tell me when to go.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. We have two streets that are right next to each other. One is our Water Street, our main street, and Water Street is a state road. We just received substantial state funding for a road construction project and redid the whole thing. And it looks nice.
Yeah.
It looks new. It certainly looks new, right?
I can't see, we can't see the photos yet. Have you switched?
Oh gosh, I have them on my phone. I don't.
Well, no, I have them up. You guys can't see them?
Mm-mm.
I can't see it.
Oh, that's weird.
Thanks, Jane.
Hold on.
Okay.
How about now? No?
It's you have to switch your share view from InDesign to whatever your images are rendered in.
Oh, okay.
So that might be in Zoom that you have to do that.
Yeah, in Zoom.
It might be easier to stop sharing, and then when you start sharing, it'll ask you which screen.
Yeah, I think sorry. Can you see this?
Yep. Just make it bigger.
Sorry about that.
It might be delayed.
You may have to switch from your Finder to whatever your image display thing is on the share screen.
Okay, let me try one more time. You can keep talking, Nate, about your downtown while I...
So the downtown is where most of our small businesses are, and virtually everything is closed right now during coronavirus, and some of our small businesses have already announced that they're not coming back or they're closing down. Everybody's in a tizzy, rightfully so. I think most of our businesses downtown will be okay in the long run, but in the short run, it's real hardship. When they designed the road construction project, there was a strong contingency that insisted on having the brick sidewalks that we've had since 1974 or so, because they wanted to maintain the historic look and feel of the downtown. And there was some talk about making some accommodations for pedestrian safety and access, like narrowing the road to travel lanes that were less than 20 feet wide. And the prevailing argument was that because it's a state art, it's basically an artery for 15,000 vehicles a day, that having that extra width allowed for traffic to continue to flow when people were making left-hand turns. And then there was another discussion about having bump outs to at least narrow the crossings for people who were like moved slow or had mobility issues or what have you, so that there were at least 3 or 4 places for them to cross more safely. And that was also that idea was challenged by and beaten by a different idea that sort of like new urbanist principles for design that would include street trees or bump outs or other things didn't fit in with the historic-y feel that people were accustomed to and would be more difficult to plow somehow. So instead of doing that, what we have is a very busy traffic corridor. People are generally cordial about pedestrians crossing the street. People are generally accommodating about that. So there is a perceived risk of a pedestrian impact from a motor vehicle. There it is. But it hasn't happened. And so that's not on the top of people's mind. But there is a sense that this is not a safe corridor for bicycle traffic. And the only people I know who ride bikes on Main Street are what I would call professional bike riders who ride to work every day and have for 20 years. So that's our Water Street, and we're really proud of Water Street. And there are a lot of great places to visit on Water Street. There are a lot of excellent places to have dinner and a drink and meet friends. And there's a super cool place there on the middle, on the left there under the pink sign, the Easy Street Tavern. Great place to hang out and dance. One street up from this fast-moving corridor is our 2nd Street corridor. And there's 2nd Street basically from City Hall. On the right-hand side is a brick building that used to be a hotel and then became housing, sort of affordable housing for our music and art community. That was subsequently purchased by a developer who turned it into an office building. And up until recently, it has been the office of the PUC. And the PUC is moving to a different facility. So on the right-hand side, we have a fairly large commercial structure for lease. On the left-hand side, in the foreground, is the row house, which is I think it's a rental that has something like 20 units in it of sort of a workforce housing, more affordable, smaller housing. As you go down the street in the subsequent images, what you see is several of the assets of the community. Like on the right is the Hubbard Free Library. We have a private library that is funded partially by the city, but is struggling to stay open. We have on the left a white building that is a city-owned museum for one of the founders of Halawa, who was a doctor, who was involved in state government. And then the beige building just after that was recently moved by Linda Bean. There it is. That's the Dummer House. The Dummer House was moved out of an alleyway up onto the street to sort of fill in a gap tooth in the street's historic facades. But since the building has been moved, the work on restoring it and painting it and fixing the roof and making it attractive hasn't been done yet. And there's just no super compelling reason for her, I suppose, to prioritize this over her other projects in the state. Linda Bean, I'm sure, will continue to work on this project. It's just, we haven't seen those beautifications yet. And I would argue that part of the reason why this building in the foreground, and then the one to the right of it, which is privately owned, it used to be the Rialto Theater, and it has a sloped floor for theater seating. The reason why that building hasn't gotten redeveloped is there's just nothing filling the vacuum. This street has been not gotten the attention that Main Street has gotten, and that's fine. But there's a real opportunity here, understanding that the DOT is not going to slow traffic on Water Street. There's a real opportunity here to turn this into a thoroughfare, into a community promenade, into a buffer zone between the downtown district and the neighborhood district that's one street up from that, and to activate the street in a way that people engage and walk past the theater building and walk past the library, and those buildings become more of a part of the fabric of the community and hopefully see more use and new investment and maintenance. This building on the left used to be like some warehouse, a working building for when Hollowell was a port city. And now it's a condominium with a mental health care provider leasing out space on the first floor. Fantastic that it's doing that. Mixed use, eyes on the street, all of that's cool. I'd like to see more of that and less of the empty buildings that need a paint job and less of the foundational institutions of the city that are struggling just to keep their doors open, but are cultural assets. And I think that we could reactivate this street as an alternative, as a walkable, bikeable, safe, family-safe alternative to Main Street, not to detract anything from Main Street, but to add some other element to the downtown experience.
Yeah.
So Nate, what priority development area did you just show us?
Can you, where's the list? It's the alternative, I gotta look it up. I think it was number 4.
I don't know. I might qualify it as just downtown.
Could be.
Most of the buildings are right on the street, right? Pretty close to the street.
Yes. Looking for the homework.
While you're looking, Jane, do you want to
Yeah.
walk us through your example?
Yeah, could I share my screen instead? Because I did all of the prototypes and see if I can make this happen.
To be able to know.
Okay, so what I did is I tried to take photos of all 6. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
of all 6 prototypes. This is downtown Rockland. I'm not going to go into great history or any of that, but just as I read the description, this is what I pictured. So this is downtown Rockland. I think it's considered downtown. Another photo of downtown Rockland. And this is, so those 2 are my downtown examples. Very tight-knit, multi-story buildings, mix of uses, residential on the upper floors, close together, a network of connected streets, sidewalks present. Then this is, it could be debated, but this is downtown Camden, which I would call a village center. It's Camden people call it downtown, so I guess it could be downtown or village center. But there is a mix of multi-story buildings. They're close together. Some are attached, most of them are attached. This is downtown Rockport, clearly a village center because some are attached and then there's gaps in the middle, kind of the missing teeth as I call that. And this is also downtown Rockport, so I call this a village center. Again, downtown Camden from a different view so you can see it. And this is downtown Rockport, again, a village center. And I think I came out of order, but this is what I would call a crossroads. This is Lincolnville Center. So the building in the middle of the screen, the red one, is Lincolnville General Store, historic building on the left. The school and town hall are up on the right, but quite a distance away, like a quarter to a half a mile. But they're closer historic buildings, not connected. Again, here's another shot. And if you know Lincolnville Center, the owner of the band Fish and his wife renovated this store, and it's now the center of that community, the hub of Lincolnville Center. This is also a crossroads. This is Hope. Again, a general store is the center of the community. There's a restaurant to the far left. Behind me, the driver is a apple orchard. There's a school beyond the stop sign, an art school, so for children. So loose-knit construction, mix of uses. They're clustered together, smaller lots, shallow setbacks, but clearly a historic area that's been reused and redeveloped. Moving on, I call this a high impact corridor. This is Rockland, the strip. Again, this is Rockland, high impact corridor. That's why I asked the question about whether funding would be available to continue this pattern of growth or instead trying to retrofit it. This is what I would call an adjacent neighborhood. This is just beyond downtown Rockport, like within walking distance, and there is a sidewalk. This is just adjacent to downtown Camden. This is Pearl Street, again, an adjacent neighborhood. You can't quite see, but right where that 25-mile speed limit is, there's a dentist's office. So it is a mix of commercial, a limited commercial, but mostly residential uses. And this is the entrance to downtown, or the village of Rockport. So again, this was on the left was an art gallery at one point, a church first, then an art gallery. Now it's residential use and it's for sale again. The harbor is to the right, but I would still call this an adjacent neighborhood as you approach the village of Rockport. And this is Pearl Street again, just showing the mix of housing units. Some are single family, some are multifamily, some are condos, some are multi-story. Whoops, sorry. And then moving on to the last form, this is what I would call a rural farmstead. I think this was out in Hope, I'm not quite sure, but that's a commercial farm building. Here's some commercial fields with buildings, sorry, farm fields with buildings. And that's all I have. So those are my ideas of how I would define those 6 prototypes.
Great. That was really good overview. Thank you, Jane.
Yep. Kara, we have about 10 minutes left.
Did you have any chats? No, okay.
Nope, just super cool. Jane, thanks.
Great. So I can click on back to, sorry, let's close your eyes for a second. So thanks. Those are really great overviews of what the development area, priority development areas might look like. And, you know, so as you go on your way after this, you know, if you can think about your own communities and whether the current buckets we have set up make sense, that would be really helpful to get more feedback on that. And I appreciate the comments about, you know, what the nature of the investment looks like and what is, you know, able to be funded. So let's dig into the development criteria a little bit. We've talked a lot and we've heard from a lot of people that on first glance, the program seems more geared toward urban than rural communities. So, you know, we've discussed the need for looking through these criteria and really establishing which are baseline criteria and which might only apply to rural communities versus communities that have villages and downtowns. And what might just be scoring criteria. So based on some feedback we've gotten, started to look at these a little bit, and again, need a lot more input on this. And for those who are just joining the conversation too, I'll just reiterate, like, this is a framework at this point and a way of taking ideas that are being generated through the Climate Council, through the DCD, Statewide Economic Development Plan, the Ryan Fecteau Housing Task Force, the DOT conversation about how to fund infrastructure. And, you know, this is a place where criteria can live, standards can live that help create that connection between state and local government, with the regional governments helping facilitate that effort, so that, you know, any recommendations that really have to do with the state trying to work with municipalities, this is a place where those things can live in a way that's coordinated and makes sense and is focused on investment. So we have a number of category is currently set up. There's more that can be done to kind of flush out additional criteria. But we took a first pass at going through some of these and establishing what might be baseline versus what might be criteria that apply to rural. And so this is all in the latest draft that was shared, but more feedback on this is really helpful. But so for planning, there's some criteria in here with the understanding that maybe there's a conversation to be had about the future of comp planning and how we can rethink what we're asking communities to do in terms of comp planning so that we're focusing on the work that really will make a difference to the future of communities versus the kind of laundry list, check the box approach that we have now, which results in a lot of work that is really analysis based instead of investment based. So this first section is really getting your community together to talk about the future and identifying your priority development areas and what the costs for the different projects that exist that you feel are important might be. And so really this is kind of baseline stuff that is the foundation of the program. And so whether you're in a rural community or not, it's stuff you should be doing just to make sure everyone is kind of on the same page. Moving over here, we have some stuff related to financial return. Nate mentioned earlier about the municipal practice of accepting private roads or private driveways and taking on the financial liability of those. That's a conversation that might need to be baseline if we're going to be focusing on return on investment. And that practice, I believe, is happening in rural communities too. So that might apply. The rest of these criteria might not be baseline. They might be work that if you do this, you might be more competitive for getting funding. So that's a question I will pose to people is, are any of the rest of these infrastructure planning criteria baseline, or they certainly, I don't believe most of these maybe are critical for rural areas. So in a rural area, you might not have to do this section.
Jane has a question. Why 5 years? Comp plans are done every 10. Should there be a requirement that the plan has received consistency approval from the state?
Yeah, this is, I think, a bigger conversation about if you're talking about investment-based planning, having more updated information is helpful. And if we are revisiting comp planning and focusing on the investment kind of areas of comp planning rather than the analysis bit, which might, it makes sense to only do that every 10 years. The timing on this, I think, is in flux. So I just keep putting a pin in that one because I don't know what the right move is at this point, because we have more conversations to have about comp planning too. So capital improvement planning, questions are whether that is, any of this is baseline or really applies to very rural communities.
Jim has a comment, which I'm not sure I understand, but a presently in circulation descriptor for infrastructure is whole life cycle.
Okay.
And just cognizant that we have 2 minutes left, I wanted to share a comment from Tony Donovan, who had to jump off early. He said, I enjoy the focus on service center communities. Let me know if there's any interest in our project to establish train service to community centers along corridors. Electrification of multimodal transportation centers of infrastructure not reliant on roads. Thanks again.
Cool.
If anyone needs Tony's contact info, you can just email us or chat.
Public participation, it's a big one, making sure that there's a lot of voices involved in the conversation. So you see on this, there's a lot of baseline, and in a couple of cases, rural would be responding to those.
Great. And Vanessa says it would be good to start. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It would be good to start using whole life cycle nomenclature, Vanessa says. Okay. I guess, Kara, what are next steps for next week? Are we going to have part 4, or is the conversation continuing? You need more comments on this area?
That's a good question. I think in terms of what would be great to get feedback on, you know, having some more feedback on what should be baseline versus, you know, which of these criteria apply in rural and which shouldn't, that would be helpful. I think it would be good if people could actually just sit down and read this and mark it up. And then also I'd love to hear from some of the people who have been involved from the regional planning organizations about the structure of how regions are involved and what their role is. I mean, there's a lot of conversation left to have on that, and with the state as well.
Great.
And as far as a call next week, I'm not sure if that makes sense, or if people feel like they've got a good overview of what we kind of need in terms of input, and I would appreciate any input on whether another call is helpful. Now or later. It's fine.
Great. Well, we have been trying to stop spamming our whole Build Maine email list with the Development Ready Communities Framework information. So if you did not receive an email and you would like to, I have your email for signups from this round. So I'll make sure you're on that sub list. And if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us again. I'm just going to put our email in the chat box. So thanks everybody for joining again, and it's been really helpful. Thanks again to Ann Ball at Maine Downtown Center, Maine Development Foundation, for hosting us. Yeah, we just appreciate their support as always.
Thank you,
Great.
everybody.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Did I get that right? Whole life cycle cost.
Oops. I'm still recording. Thank you.